All right. Hello, everybody. It is just a couple minutes past the hour, so I think it's probably time to get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. My name is Greg Gertmenian. I am Slated's Head of Business Development and Film Analytics. And today, as the title of the webinar may suggest, we're going to be talking about some of the reasons behind the recent layoffs and budget cuts in the studio system and what that could mean for the independent film market, as well as how online marketplaces like Slated can be part of the solution. I have a few slides that I'm going to walk us through today. That'll probably take around 15 minutes or so. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So you'll see a Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom. You can go ahead and type your questions there now or as the presentation is going on. It's never too soon to type your questions. That just gives us plenty of fodder to get into a conversation as soon as the presentation portion is over. So go ahead and start to type your questions there as soon as you think of them, and we'll jump into them as soon as the presentation ends. So before we dive into the presentation itself, for those of you who don't know, Slated is offering a limited time opportunity to become a shareholder in our company. As a virtual studio, Slated has tripled its film finance revenues last year, releasing 11 movies, and we recently just executive produced our 47th film, if you can believe that. So if you'd like to be part of that action and own a piece of a growing independent studio, that link is wefunder.com/slated, which we will also share in the description of this video when it's posted. So, all right, let's jump right in. Most of you have probably seen these headlines over the past year announcing big layoffs at nearly all of the major studios. Netflix did 2 rounds of layoffs between April and June. They removed 545 employees of their duties, or roughly 4% of their total workforce. And then just this month, Bob Iger announced his plans to cut 7,000 more jobs at Disney. That's a bit more than 3% of Disney's total global workforce. And Warner Brothers Discovery, the newly formed entity between Warner Media and Discovery, announced in November that it's looking for $3 billion in cost savings over the next 3 years. And that's after it cut 26% of its Warner Brothers Television Group's workforce in October, and then another 14% of HBO Max and HBO Max's staff in August. So the question is really why, after all these years of expansion, studios are suddenly desperate to shed costs. And of course, macroeconomic factors are at play here, but there are also strong signs that the streaming wars are starting to reach a point of market saturation. You can see all the different tiles on the screen here. It's somewhat dizzying for the consumer. And repeated surveys from firms like KPMG have found that most consumers are really only willing to spend about $40 on average in total for their streaming services. And that breaks down to about $10 on average for 4 different streaming services. And you can start to see some of that resistance in this graph here, which shows the subscriber growth of the 2 biggest streaming platforms, that's Netflix and Disney Plus. Disney Plus subscribers dropped globally. They reduced by about 2.5 million subscribers just this past quarter. And that was the first loss of subscribers for Disney Plus since it launched in November of 2019. And Netflix, before that, had just lost 200,000 subscribers in Q1 of last year, and then nearly another 1 million subscribers the following quarter. And that was Netflix's first loss in subscribers in about a decade. And Netflix executives, for their part, blamed competing services that were starting to take a toll. Of course, that has an impact on these companies' valuations. And you can see that in this Google Finance chart, which shows the impact that Netflix's subscriber loss had on their value. Netflix's stock had already been down 40% year to date in 2022 due to other economic concerns. But then when Netflix shared the news of its subscriber loss in April, you can see in that red box on the right that their stock dropped another 28%. And over a period of 7.5 months, Netflix saw a 74% reduction in the value of its company. That's obviously billions and billions of dollars, from $690 per share at its peak to roughly $175 per share. So it's natural that after years of trying to outspend each other to gain market share, that studios would then seek to adjust their content budgets, among other things. And across all the studios, we expect that content spending is going to grow by 2% this year, which would be the slowest content spending growth in about 10 years. But to highlight a few examples on the screen here, we have three of the biggest spenders: Disney, NBCU, and Netflix. Notably, their content spends in this chart includes music, third-party content licensing, and films and television. That includes originals and shows and TV that shows and films that they license. So Netflix announced, as you can see in those bright blue bars, recently that it's going to plateau its spending at $17 billion a year for the next few years. But that was after it reduced its content budget by 5%, which you can see between 2021 and 2022. And in May, Disney announced it would cut its content budget by $1 billion as well, from $33 billion in that tall, pale blue bar to $32 billion. And the second biggest spender on content, NBCU, announced last September that it plans to cut $1 billion from the budgets of its television networks alone. And yet, with studios reducing their spending, they seem to be spending more money to acquire independent films. That number seems to be going up. This is a chart that shows the sales at Sundance over the past few years. And of course, Sundance isn't a perfect reflection of the independent film market as a whole, but it does usually offer some pretty important signals. So you can see that in 2021, the total number of aggregate reported sales from the festival was $45 million. That jumped in 2022 to $52 million in reported sales from 7 movies that disclosed their sales values. And then just this past year or last month, that grew again to $54 million from just 4 movies who reported their sales. And of course, we know this isn't a comprehensive value, right? Because the portion of films that actually report how much they sold for, or rather the portion of studios that report what they paid, is going down over the years. So we know that there's more money going into that market than this graph suggests. But if you look at the sales figures that are reported, one trend is pretty clear. And that's that each year, the amount that studios are willing to pay for independent content seems to be increasing. And you can really tell that when you look at the high watermark setters over the past few years. You can see that in 2020, Palm Springs set the record. Palm Springs broke the record that had been set in 2016 for the most paid at a festival when it sold for $17.5 million. And then in 2021, Coda broke that record, Palm Springs record, when it sold for $25 million to Apple. And then just this year at Sundance 2023, last month, Flora and Son and Talk to Me set a new record by being 2 films that both sold in the $20 million range. That was a first for the festival as well. And of course, we don't know what the fates of Flora and Son and Talk to Me are going to be in terms of their performance, but the other purchases seem to be paying off for the streamers. Palm Springs, when it launched on Hulu, broke Hulu's opening weekend record by netting more hours watched over the first 3 days than any other film on Hulu. And Coda won 3 Oscars last year for Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Supporting Actor, and of course, Best Picture. So even though studios have announced budget cuts to their content spend, they still continue to spend more on independent films that they feel could be awards contenders or have broad commercial appeal. And the studio's mentality about that trend is maybe best summarized by this quote from NBCU CEO Jeff Shell, when he stated that if somebody comes to Peacock to watch Nope and sees that we have another 12 movies on there, people are going to talk about it. Movies drive platforms. Well, of course, at Slated, we tend to agree. Studios are they're going to need to continue making acquisitions to keep their streaming platforms stocked with fresh original features. And with higher budgets, they'll have to continue looking to the independent film market for that content. At Slated, we've heard from 2 different studio entities that they're looking to increase the amount of films they make or acquire in the $1 million range to 100 movies per year. That's obviously a lot. So if you're an independent filmmaker, that puts you in a position of power. It's a bit more of a seller's market now than perhaps it was before. And the question for independent filmmakers is really, how do you take advantage of that? First, I think we need to understand the pros and cons for studios of engaging with the independent film market as a whole. And the advantages are on the left here. You can see that for one, it's cost efficient. The average price of an independent film is around $2.5 million. That means that studios can generally spend less money to acquire independent films. And of course, it's much cheaper than if they were to develop the movie in-house and pay studio rates from script to screen. Number two, original films are more authentic and original oftentimes, whether it's Barbarian or Triangle of Sadness. I think if you look at the films that were released over the past few years, some of the most subversive, exciting, and surprising films were made by independent filmmakers or at least independently financed. And number three, there's plenty of them. There were over 4,000 feature films submitted to Sundance this year alone. Roughly 60% of them came from the States and 40% came from abroad. But there are still two key roadblocks when it comes to studios engaging with independent filmmakers. You can see those on the right. Number one, the independent film market is still very disorganized. Outside of a handful of meaningful festivals that studios are willing to travel to, there isn't really one centralized market for independent films. And number two, because of the sheer volume of independent films that get made every year, studios face the challenge of not knowing which are worth their time. And it can be pretty expensive to pay executives to review them all, especially if those studios are considering engaging with films at earlier stages. For instance, the script stage, when we know that there are hundreds of thousands or millions of scripts floating around at any given time. So that's where marketplaces like Slated can be especially helpful. Slated solves those last two problems by organizing the independent film market in one place. As an online marketplace, filmmakers can join and list their films for free. Our matchmaking system then matches them with collaborators and thousands of film investors to get those movies packaged, financed, and released. And we provide analytics that help both sides of the market decide which projects to focus on. Slated is the leading company in this space. You can see from those stats, we're very proud of at the top that we have over 67,000 members at this point. We get around 2,000 films listed on the market every single year. And we have $1 billion in investor capacity across our community of 2,300 vetted investors. So let's see how this system squares with the cost and spending issues that studios are currently struggling with. I think we should start first with the scoring system, because having a rating system that works is critically important to any functioning marketplace. And Slated script and financial analysis has been proven to be 80% or more accurate just from the script stage. And that's accuracy in terms of predicting which films will be creatively and financially successful. That's really helpful because most movies list on Slated are an average of 3 years before they're made and released. So in the case of Palm Springs, that project's script analysis indicated its outstanding creative potential way back in 2018, a full 2 years before its $17.5 million bidding war. You can see in the script grid on the left that it drew 3 considers across the board from all 3 people on our team that read, and it got 4 out of 5s in several sections, including dialogue, tone, and craft. And our script analyst wrote that Palm Springs is genuinely funny, and it comes up with a number of laugh out loud moments that reveal its clever and inventive spirit. They also said it makes interesting and exciting tonal choices that subvert tradition and make it feel memorable and engaging. That's a pretty good review when it comes to reading indie comedy scripts. And if you're a studio that wants to engage with independent filmmakers, you also want to make sure that you are working with the best the industry has to offer. And when it comes to our Slated community, we have some pretty incredible proof points to that effect. Number one, as you can see, 100% of the movies that were nominated for Best Picture Oscars this year had Slated members involved in key roles. And number two, 63 of the films at this year's Sundance lineup had Slated members involved as well. That was a total of 186 Slated members. So as a growing marketplace, Slated really represents sort of a year-round Sundance, giving studios the opportunity to acquire movies well before the bidding war begins, although we don't mind those as well. But at Slated, we're pretty proactive. While the studios are spending time adjusting their budgets and trying to get their budgets right, we've started our own studio label in the form of executive producer services. EP services, if you're not familiar with it, it's sort of like the studio layer that sits on top of our marketplace and provides additional support to the highest scoring projects. Our EPs can advise on script development, budget, the finance plan, and they can also make personal introductions to casting directors, investors, and distributors. So let's see how that's working out. In this graph, you can see how the scalability of a marketplace plays out versus the traditional studios. Slated's EP team went from releasing 3 movies over the past several years to releasing 11 movies last year. And that's in addition to putting another 12 films into production. That's as many films as some studios themselves put out. But we didn't need dozens of executives and hundreds of support staff in order to do that. We did it with a team of just 4 executive producers. And of course, that had an impact on our numbers, on the growth of our revenue. Last year, Slated tripled its film finance revenues. You can see that it was up 206% year over year, and we hit records across the board for all of our other revenue lines. That includes a record number in analysis sales as well. And because we're a marketplace, again, and not a traditional studio, Slated actually spent less money, not more, as it scaled up its business. So while Slated's EP team tripled the number of movies that it made, the company actually reduced its spend by 65%. So we feel very strongly at Slated that we have cracked the code on making a large number of films, high quality films at that, for far less money. And it really comes down to leveraging the collective talents of our community, using smart matching to introduce the right projects to the right people at the right time, and then just giving a light touch support to the strongest projects when they need it most. So while we're operating like a virtual studio ourselves, Slated's EP team also works with a network of around 280 sales and distribution companies, including some of the companies on the screen. And apologies for my slow click. And in fact, Slated's EP team has 3 completed films with Universal Pictures right now that are planning their release. So if you'd like to help Slated continue to meet this moment and ensure that independent films remain part of the equation for studios' content strategy year-round, consider investing in Slated and becoming a shareholder via WeFunder. The more filmmakers that own a piece of Slated, the more powerful we can be as a force representing independent filmmakers' interests as the studio and independent markets continue to evolve. So that is the presentation. I hope that was really helpful at providing an overview of the landscape and the macroeconomic factors that are feeding the independent film markets right now. Thank you so much for listening. And now it's time for the best part. We're going to get into the Q&A.